At 4:17 local time on February 6, 2023, a rupture began beneath the surface of southern Turkey. The East Anatolian Fault, a transform boundary stretching across the country's southeastern provinces, experienced a catastrophic failure. The initial earthquake registered magnitude 7.8, one of the most powerful seismic events recorded in the region's modern history. The rupture propagated bilaterally along the fault line, tearing through approximately 300 kilometers of crust in less than 70 seconds. The hypocenter was located near Pazacek in Kahramanmaraş province. At a depth of approximately 18 kilometers, this relatively shallow depth meant that seismic energy reached the surface with minimal attenuation, concentrating destructive forces across a wide geographic area. The rupture moved both northeast and southwest from the initial breakpoint, following the fault's natural geometry through densely populated regions. 9 hours later, at 1324, a second major earthquake struck. This event measured magnitude 7.5 and occurred approximately 95 kilometers to the north of the first rupture. Centered near the second earthquake was not an aftershock in the conventional sense, but rather a separate rupture triggered by stress transfer from the first event. The two earthquakes together released seismic energy equivalent to hundreds of nuclear weapons, fundamentally altering the stress regime across multiple fault segments. The East Anatolian Fault system had been relatively quiet for centuries. Historical records indicated no earthquakes of comparable magnitude along this particular segment. Since 1114 CE, the fault had accumulated approximately 900 years of tectonic strain, storing elastic energy as the Arabian Plate pushed northward against the Anatolian Plate at a rate of roughly 10 millimeters per year. When the accumulated stress exceeded the frictional strength of the fault zone, the release was sudden and complete. Seismographic stations across 3 continents recorded the event within minutes. The surface waves generated by the initial rupture traveled at approximately 3.5 kilometers per second, reaching Istanbul 620 kilometers away in less than 3 minutes. The shaking lasted between 40 and 90 seconds depending on distance from the epicenter, with the longest duration occurring in areas where basin effects trapped and amplified. Seismic waves. Ground acceleration in the most affected areas exceeded 1 times the acceleration of gravity, meaning that objects not secured to foundations were briefly thrown upward. Peak ground displacement reached several meters in locations directly above the fault trace, where the surface ruptured and created visible scarps. Horizontal displacement measurements taken after the event showed that some areas had shifted laterally by more than 3 meters relative to their previous positions. The rupture occurred during the coldest hours of winter night, when outdoor temperatures hovered near freeza. Most of the affected population was indoors and asleep. The darkness and cold would become critical factors in the hours that followed, as rescue operations began without adequate lighting, and survivors faced immediate threats from exposure. The seismic sequence included thousands of aftershocks in the days and weeks following the main events. More than 100 aftershocks exceeded magnitude 5.0, each capable of causing additional structural damage to already weakened buildings. The aftershock distribution mapped the complex geometry of fault interactions, revealing previously unmapped fault branches and complicating assessments of future seismic hazard. The earthquake zone encompassed 11 provinces across southern Turkey, covering an area larger than many European countries: Kahramanmaraş, Hatay, Adıyaman, Malatya, Anwi, Urfa, Jokbaki, Ehi, Kilis, Osmaniye, Adana, and Elazığ. All experienced severe to catastrophic shaking. The affected region contains cities with populations exceeding 1 million people, alongside hundreds of smaller towns and villages. Hatay province, located near the intersection of 3 major tectonic plates, suffered particularly extensive damage. The provincial capital Antakya, continuously inhabited for millennia, experienced widespread structural collapse. Buildings that had stood for decades disintegrated within seconds. The city's historic quarter, containing structures from the Ottoman period and earlier, was largely reduced to rubble. The Habibi Necker Mosque, one of the earliest mosque structures in Anatolia, sustained major damage to its minaret and walls. Kahraman, the province containing both epicenters, faced complete destruction in multiple districts. The city of Kahramanmaraş itself, with a pre-earthquake population exceeding 650,000, saw thousands of buildings collapse or become structurally compromised beyond repair. Neighborhoods that had expanded rapidly in recent decades experienced the highest collapse rates, reflecting construction during periods of less rigorous seismic code. Enforcement. Adıyaman province lost entire residential blocks. The city of Adıyaman, positioned in a sedimentary basin that amplified seismic waves, witnessed cascading building failures as structures pancaked floor by floor. The local hospital sustained damage that rendered it inoperable, eliminating the primary medical facility for a region with over 600,000 residents. Just as demand for emergency medical care reached unprecedented levels, Malatya, despite being positioned somewhat further from the epicenters, experienced significant destruction due to local soil conditions. The city sits atop deep alluvial deposits that underwent liquefaction during the shaking, causing buildings to sink and tilt even when structural frames remained intact. Entire apartment blocks leaned at impossible angles, their foundations undermined by the temporary transformation of soil into a fluid-like state. The city of Isuahai in Gaziantep province was effectively erased from its previous configuration. More than 90% of buildings in the urban center collapsed or were damaged beyond habitability. The town, which had served as a regional agricultural hub, lost its administrative buildings, schools, healthcare facilities, and commercial infrastructure simultaneously. In the immediate aftermath, the scale of destruction made accurate damage assessment impossible. Roads had buckled and fractured, rendering many areas inaccessible to emergency vehicles. Communication infrastructure had failed across wide areas, severing connections between affected communities and the outside world. The electrical grid had collapsed, plunging cities into darkness precisely when artificial lighting was most critically needed. The destruction was not limited to modern construction. Archaeological sites, spanning millennia, sustained damage that represented irreversible loss of cultural heritage. The Roman era city walls of Antakya cracked and partially collapsed. Byzantine churches, Ottoman era, caravanserais, and medieval fortifications all suffered structural damage. Each collapsed historic building represented not merely lost architecture, but the physical embodiment of centuries of human habitation and cultural continuity. Village communities in mountainous areas faced isolation as the few roads connecting them to larger population centers became impassable. Landslides triggered by the shaking buried sections of roadway and entire structures. In some locations, rescue teams could not reach affected communities for days, during which time survivors had to extract trapped victims using only hand tools and whatever materials could be improvised from the debris. When seismic waves pass through the ground beneath a structure, they induce motion in the building's foundation. The building, possessing mass and therefore inertia, resists this motion. The result is stress that propagates through the structural frame. Whether a building survives depends on whether its structural elements can absorb and dissipate this energy, without exceeding their material strength limits. Reinforced concrete, the dominant construction material in Turkish urban areas, behaves in predictable ways under seismic loading. Concrete provides excellent compressive strength but limited tensile strength. Steel reinforcement compensates for this weakness, providing tensile capacity that prevents concrete from disintegrating when subjected to pulling forces. The effectiveness of this system depends entirely on the quality of construction, execution. Many collapsed buildings exhibited a failure mode, known as soft story collapse. This occurs when a building's ground floor has significantly less lateral stiffness than upper floors, often due to large openings for commercial use or parking. When seismic waves induce lateral motion, the soft story deforms disproportionately, concentrating damage. Once the columns on this floor fail, the entire upper structure drops vertically, pancaking floor by floor. Inadequate reinforcement detailing represents another critical failure. Mechanism observed throughout the earthquake zone. Reinforcing bars must be properly connected at joints and corners, with sufficient overlap and confinement to transfer loads between elements. In numerous collapsed structures, post-disaster forensic examination revealed minimal or absent reinforcement at critical joints, meaning that concrete elements essentially pulled apart at connection points when subjected to lateral forces. The quality of concrete itself varied dramatically across the affected structures. Proper concrete requires precise ratios of cement, aggregate, and water, along with adequate curing time to develop full strength. Construction practices that deviate from these requirements produce concrete with reduced capacity. Laboratory testing of samples from collapsed buildings revealed compressive strengths well below design specifications in many cases, indicating fundamental material deficiencies. Column dimensions and reinforcement spacing showed systematic inadequacies in many failed structures. Seismic design codes specify minimum column sizes and maximum spacing between lateral ties, based on expected seismic forces and the need to confine concrete. Thinner columns with widely spaced ties lack the capacity to sustain large deformations without buckling or disintegrating. This failure mode was observed repeatedly across different building types and ages. Resonance affects amplified damage in buildings with certain height ranges. Every structure has natural vibration, frequencies determined by its mass and stiffness. When seismic waves contain energy at frequencies matching these natural frequencies, the building's response amplifies dramatically. Mid-ridge buildings, typically 5 to 10 stories, proved particularly vulnerable because their natural periods coincided with the dominant period of ground motion in many locations. Basin effects: concentrated damage in specific geographic zones. Sedimentary basins filled with soft soils trap seismic waves, causing them to reverberate and amplify. Cities built atop such basins experienced shaking intensities, far exceeding what would be expected based on distance from the fault alone. Antequa's position in the Omic Basin created these conditions, contributing to the city's exceptional destruction rate despite being somewhat further from the epicenter than other affected areas. Some relatively new buildings collapsed despite having been constructed after modern seismic code revisions. This apparent paradox reflects the gap between code requirements and actual construction quality. Design documents may specify adequate reinforcement and concrete strength, but construction execution determines actual performance. Inspection regimes during construction, material quality control, and enforcement mechanisms all influenced whether design capacity translates into actual seismic resistance. Non-structural components caused casualties even in buildings where primary structural frames survived. Heavy partition walls, improperly secured building facades, and ceiling elements became projectiles during shaking. Stairwells, often constructed as separate elements, not fully integrated with primary structure, twisted and collapsed, blocking evacuation routes and trapping occupants on upper floors. The immediate toll reached catastrophic dimensions. More than 53,000 people died in Turkey within the first weeks following the earthquakes. Thousands more sustained injuries requiring hospitalization. The mortality concentrated during the first 24 hours, when individuals trapped beneath collapsed structures succumbed to crush injuries, asphyxiation, or exposure to sub-freezing temperatures. Crush syndrome emerged as a significant medical challenge. This condition occurs when prolonged compression of muscle tissue leads to cellular breakdown, releasing toxic substances including myoglobin and potassium into the bloodstream. When victims are extracted from debris after many hours of entrapment, the sudden restoration of circulation can precipitate acute kidney failure and cardiac arrest if not managed properly. Medical teams faced thousands of cases requiring immediate dialysis and intensive metabolic management. Traumatic amputations occurred at unprecedented scale. Medical facilities performed emergency amputations when limbs had been crushed beyond salvage or when compartment syndrome threatened life. Survivors underwent these procedures in field hospitals and makeshift surgical suites, often without adequate anesthesia or postoperative care facilities. The long-term implications for these individuals included permanent disability, prosthetic requirements, and lifetime medical needs. Spinal cord injuries created another population facing permanent disability. Vertebral fractures and spinal trauma from falling debris resulted in paraplegia and quadriplegia. The specialized rehabilitation these injuries require was largely unavailable in the affected region, necessitating long-distance transfers to facilities in other parts of the country. Many survivors faced futures fundamentally altered by injuries sustained in seconds. Head trauma ranged from minor concussions to severe traumatic brain injury. Falling debris struck skulls with forces sufficient to cause fractures, intracranial hemorrhage, and diffuse axonal injury. The spectrum of cognitive and physical impairments resulting from these injuries would only become fully apparent in subsequent months as survivors progressed through recovery and rehabilitation. Children comprised a significant proportion of casualties and injured survivors. Schools had not yet started for the day when the first earthquake struck, meaning most children were at home. Residential buildings collapsed with entire families inside, creating scenarios where parents and children were trapped in adjacent voids within rubble piles, aware of each other's presence but unable to provide assistance. Hypothermia represented an additional threat multiplier. February temperatures in the region regularly
Haber
dropped below freezing
saldım
overnight.
tez
Individuals trapped in rubble without adequate clothing or protection from elements faced hours of exposure. Even those who survived the initial collapse faced death from hypothermia if extraction was delayed. Rescue teams encountered victims who had survived crushing injuries, but succumbed to cold before they could be reached. Dehydration killed trapped survivors who might otherwise have endured until rescue. The human body can survive weeks without food, but only days without water. Individuals conscious within rubble voids had no access to fluids. Medical teams responding to the disaster transported vast quantities of intravenous solutions to treat severe dehydration in survivors, pulled from collapsed structures after days of entrapment. Psychological trauma affected virtually every survivor, witnessing building collapse, experiencing entrapment, losing family members, or discovering bodies in rubble created conditions for acute stress disorder and post-traumatic stress. The sudden and violent nature of the event, combined with the extended period of threat from aftershocks, meant that survivors' nervous systems remained in sustained states of hypervigilance and threat detection. Elderly populations faced compounded vulnerabilities. Pre-existing medical conditions required continuous medication and monitoring. When healthcare infrastructure collapsed and supply chains severed, elderly individuals with chronic diseases found themselves without access to essential medications. Dialysis patients, diabetics requiring insulin, and cardiac patients needing blood pressure management faced immediate medical crises. The collapse of hospital infrastructure created immediate healthcare access crises. Major medical facilities in Hatay, Kahramanmaraş, and Agayaman sustained structural damage, rendering them partially or completely inoperable. The Hatay State Hospital, one of the largest medical complexes in the region, suffered damage forcing complete evacuation. Medical equipment, pharmaceutical supplies, and patient records were buried in rubble or rendered inaccessible. Field hospitals deployed by national and international medical organizations provided critical care capacity in the initial weeks. These temporary facilities operated in tents and prefabricated structures erected in parking lots, parks, and any available open space. They performed emergency surgeries, managed trauma cases, and provided basic medical services. However, their capacity remained orders of magnitude below that of the destroyed permanent facilities. Infectious disease risks escalated in the aftermath. Disrupted water supply systems became contaminated with sewage as underground infrastructure fractured. Survivors living in temporary shelters lacked access to adequate sanitation facilities. Crowded conditions in tent camps created ideal conditions for respiratory pathogen transmission. Public health officials mounted vaccination campaigns targeting measles, tetanus, and other vaccine-preventable diseases to prevent outbreaks in displaced populations. Waterborne illness became a significant concern as communities relied on emergency water supplies of uncertain quality. Gastrointestinal infections increased as hygiene conditions deteriorated. Children, elderly individuals, and those with compromised immune systems faced elevated risks from diarrheal diseases that would ordinarily be manageable but became life-threatening in the post-disaster environment. Chronic disease management collapsed across the affected region. Diabetic patients lost access to insulin supplies and blood glucose monitoring. Hypertensive individuals could not obtain blood pressure medications. Psychiatric patients requiring continuous medication for mood stabilization or psychosis. Management experienced dangerous gaps in treatment. Dialysis centers, destruction left kidney failure, patients without access to life-sustaining treatments. Wound care challenges persisted for months. Survivors who sustained lacerations, burns, or other soft tissue injuries during the earthquakes required ongoing dressing changes and infection monitoring. Limited medical infrastructure meant that many individuals managed their own wound care with minimal professional supervision, resulting in complications including cellulitis, abscess formation, and sepsis. Maternal and neonatal health services essentially ceased in many affected areas. Pregnant women due for delivery found themselves without access to obstetric care. Births occurred in tents, temporary shelters, and makeshift facilities without proper sterile conditions or emergency obstetric capacity. Neonates requiring specialized care had no access to neonatal intensive care units. Mental health services proved severely inadequate for the scale of need. Psychiatric hospitals sustained damage, and mental health professionals themselves were affected by the disaster. The population of individuals experiencing acute psychological distress numbered in the millions. While available counseling and psychiatric services could serve only a small fraction, many survivors endured months of untreated psychological symptoms. Pharmaceutical supply chains took weeks to reestablish. Essential medications were in critically short supply during the first month after the earthquakes. Antibiotics, pain medications, insulin, cardiovascular drugs, and psychiatric medications all faced shortages. Distribution networks had to be rebuilt from scratch as warehouses collapsed and transportation routes remained impassable. Dental health deteriorated rapidly in displaced populations. Toothbrushes, toothpaste, and basic oral hygiene supplies were not prioritized in early aid distributions. Within weeks, survivors experienced increased rates of dental pain, infection, and decay. Dental services were essentially unavailable, leaving individuals to endure untreated dental emergencies. Within days of the earthquakes, more than 3 million people had been displaced from their homes. This figure represented the entire population of some European nations suddenly rendered homeless in mid. The scale of displacement exceeded the capacity of any existing humanitarian response framework, requiring the mobilization of resources on a level comparable to responding to major armed conflicts. Tent cities emerged across the affected provinces. Open spaces, including parks, sports fields, and agricultural land, transformed into sprawling encampments, housing thousands of individuals. Tents provided minimal protection from the elements, with temperatures inside dropping near freezing during winter nights. Families clustered in spaces measuring just a few square meters, without privacy, heating, or adequate insulation. The Turkish government and aid organizations deployed shipping containers modified as temporary housing units. These structures, while offering better protection than tents, became homes for tens of thousands of families facing indefinite displacement. Container settlements sprouted on the outskirts of damaged cities, creating new temporary communities with their own social dynamics and challenges. Sanitation, infrastructure, and displacement camps proved grossly inadequate. Toilet facilities served populations far exceeding their design capacity. Wastewater management systems were rudimentary or absent. During rainy periods, camps transformed into muddy quagmires, with standing water creating breeding grounds for disease vectors and making movement between shelters difficult. Women and girls faced particular vulnerabilities in displacement settings. Inadequate lighting in camps created safety concerns. Sanitation facilities lacked privacy and security. The breakdown of social structures and protective community networks increased risks of gender-based violence. Single mothers with children faced extreme challenges in securing resources and maintaining safety. Educational continuity ceased for millions of children. Schools had collapsed or were damaged beyond use throughout the earthquake zone. Even in areas where school buildings survived, they were often repurposed as emergency shelters. Children spent months without access to education, falling behind academically and losing the structure and social connection that schooling provides. Elderly individuals in displacement camps faced acute hardship. The physical demands of camp life, including long walks to sanitation facilities, standing in lines for food distribution, and enduring cold conditions, exceeded many elderly people's physical capacities. Chronic health conditions worsened without adequate medical management. Some elderly survivors simply could not adapt to the harsh conditions and died in camps. Family separation occurred through multiple mechanisms. Injured individuals were evacuated to hospitals in distant cities, losing contact with family members who remained in the disaster zone. Children became separated from parents during evacuations or when parents were killed. Extended families that had lived in close proximity found themselves scattered across different displacement locations. Internal migration flows accelerated as displaced populations sought opportunities elsewhere. Young families left the earthquake zone entirely, relocating to western cities including Istanbul, Izmir, and Ankara. This exodus drained the affected region of working-age population and human capital, precisely when reconstruction would require intensive labor and skills. Housing prices in receiving cities surged as displaced populations competed for rental accommodation. Istanbul and other major cities experienced rent increases of 30 to 50% in the months following the earthquakes. Displaced families faced impossible choices between remaining in inadequate temporary shelters in the earthquake zone or moving to expensive cities, where they could afford only the most marginal housing, pets, and livestock. Created additional challenges in displacement. Families arrived at camps with dogs, cats, and occasionally chickens or other small animals that had survived the disaster. Camp regulations often prohibited animals, forcing families to choose between their pets and access to shelter. Rural families who had kept livestock faced economic ruin as their animals died or were lost. The Hatay Archaeology Museum housed one of the world's most significant collections of Roman era mosaics, including works from Antioch that ranked among antiquity's finest examples of the art form. The earthquakes caused extensive damage to the museum building, collapsing sections of roof and walls. Mosaics that had survived to millennia fractured and disintegrated within seconds. Some panels could potentially be restored through painstaking conservation, but others were lost irretrievably. The Gaziantep Castle, a Byzantine-era fortification that had stood since the 6th century, sustained major structural damage. Portions of the defensive walls collapsed, and towers that had overlooked the city for 15 centuries crumbled. The castle had served not merely as a historical monument, but as a defining element of Gaziantep's urban identity, visible from across the city as a connection to its deep history. Churches, mosques, and other religious structures spanning multiple faiths and centuries suffered damage throughout the region. The St. Paul's Church in Antikyia, associated with the apostles' time in the city, described in biblical texts, sustained damage to its ancient stone walls. The loss represented not merely architectural damage but the physical severing of connections to religious and cultural narratives stretching back millennia. Traditional housing in Old Quarter represented an endangered architectural tradition. These structures featured distinctive stone construction, interior courtyards, and architectural elements reflecting centuries of Syrian and Mediterranean influence. The earthquakes destroyed much of this remaining traditional architecture, eliminating physical examples of building, techniques, and aesthetic traditions that had evolved over generations. Musical institutions faced existential challenges. The Hatay State Symphony Orchestra lost its performance venue when the concert hall sustained structural damage. Instruments were destroyed or damaged. Musicians themselves were among the casualties and displaced population. The orchestra, which had served as a regional cultural institution, essentially ceased to exist as a functioning ensemble. Libraries and archives containing irreplaceable historical documents, suffered catastrophic losses. Municipal archives housing Ottoman-era property records, birth and death registers, and administrative documents were buried in collapsed buildings. These documents represented not merely historical curiosities, but the written evidence of property ownership, family lineage, and legal rights
Rescue
extending
workers
across
are combing
generations.
through the rubble of
Craft
collapsed
traditions faced
buildings,
disruption as
where
master
many
artisans were
remain
killed,
trapped.
displaced,
The tremor
or
will-
lost their workshops. Gaziantep's
Videos show
coppersmithing
survivors
traditions,
picking through
Antakya's
rubble of
mosaic
collapsed
artisanship,
buildings in
and other
freezing
regional crafts
conditions.
depending on master-apprentice knowledge
The
transfer faced
epicenter was
uncertain
close to the
futures.
Turkish
When
city of
masters die without
Gaziantep,
having transmitted
where
their knowledge,
eyewitnesses
entire craft
described
traditions
people
can
rushing
vanish within a
towards open
generation.
spaces
Oral
as
histories and
three
intangible
massive
cultural
tremors
heritage
hit.
became even more fragile as elderly
Building
bearers of
after
traditional
building
knowledge died.
flattened.
Stories,
The governor
songs,
of one
recipes,
Turkish province
and customs
says at least
transmitted through generations
130
existed only in the
buildings are
memories of
reported
living
to have
individuals.
collapsed in his
When those
region
individuals
alone.
died in the earthquakes,
The worst
their
damage
knowledge died
appears
with
to
them,
be across
leaving
a
gaps
huge
in cultural
area of
continuity
southern
that cannot
Turkey
be
and
filled through
northern Syria.
reconstruction. Culinary
The latter
traditions faced
already
threats
a
as
region
restaurants,
devastated
recipes,
by war.
and cooking knowledge were lost. Antakya's distinctive cuisine, reflecting Arab, Turkish, and Mediterranean influences, depended on specific restaurants and family recipes passed down through generations. When restaurants collapsed and cooks died, recipes existed only in fragmentary memories. If they survived at all, photography studios and family photo collections were destroyed throughout the affected region. These images represented irreplaceable visual records of family histories, community events, and daily life across decades. Their loss meant that visual evidence of lives lived, relationships formed, and moments experienced simply vanished, leaving families without even photographic evidence of deceased relatives. 12 months after the earthquakes, rubble clearance remained incomplete across significant areas of the affected cities. Mountains of concrete, twisted rebar, and fragmented building materials still defined the landscape in Antakya, Kahramanmaraş, and other heavily damaged urban centers. The physical removal of millions of tons of debris proceeded slowly, constrained by limited heavy equipment, disposal site capacity, and the dangerous nature of unstable, partially collapsed structures. Temporary housing provided shelter for hundreds of thousands who remained displaced a year after the disaster. Container cities became semi-permanent communities, with residents adapting to extended habitation and spaces designed for temporary emergency shelter. Schools operated in container structures. Small businesses opened in containers. Life adapted to these circumstances out of necessity rather than choice. Reconstruction planning confronted complex questions of land ownership, building regulations, and urban design philosophy. Should cities be rebuilt in their previous configurations or reimagined entirely? How should building codes be updated and critically enforced? Who held responsibility for financing reconstruction for property owners who lacked insurance or resources? These questions remained partially unresolved a year later, delaying reconstruction initiation. Economic activity in the affected region contracted dramatically. Businesses that had provided employment for hundreds of thousands of workers simply ceased to exist. Agricultural production declined as farmers lost equipment, storage facilities, and market access. The regional economy, already less developed than Western Turkey, faced long-term damage that would require years or decades to overcome. Population loss changed the demographic character of affected cities. Young, educated, working-age individuals with mobility and resources relocated to other parts of the country, pursuing employment and educational opportunities. The remaining population skewed older and poorer, lacking the resources to relocate but facing limited prospects in the damaged region. Trauma manifested in enduring psychological symptoms across the affected population. Hypervigilance to environmental cues resembling earthquake shaking remained universal. Sleep disturbances persisted as survivors experienced nightmares or startled awake at minor vibrations. Depression rates elevated as individuals confronted grief, loss, and radically altered life. Circumstances extending indefinitely into the future. Anniversary periods reopened psychological wounds. As the one-year mark approached, media coverage increased, memorial events were planned, and collective remembrance created conditions for psychological distress. Resurgence. Survivors who had achieved some measure of psychological stabilization experienced symptom exacerbation as they were compelled to relive the trauma through remembrance. Activities. Children exhibited behavioral and developmental changes reflecting their trauma exposure. Academic performance declined among school-aged children who had experienced the earthquakes. Younger children showed regressive behaviors, including bedwetting, separation anxiety, and loss of previously acquired skills. Adolescents demonstrated increased rates of risk-taking behavior and substance experimentation as they struggled to process their experiences. Healthcare systems remained degraded with capacity, substantially below pre-earthquake levels. Permanent medical facilities had not been rebuilt. Field hospitals had closed or transitioned to reduced operations. Medical professionals who had deployed to the region during the emergency phase had returned to their home institutions. The population faced ongoing healthcare access deficits with no clear timeline for restoration of previous capacity. Aftershocks continued to pose risks and maintain population anxiety. While their frequency and magnitude decreased over time, seismic activity in the region remained elevated relative to pre-earthquake baseline. Each perceptible aftershock re-triggered fear responses and anxiety, preventing psychological recovery and deterring individuals from returning to or remaining in the region. The earthquakes created an absence that cannot be quantified through statistics alone. The 53,000 deaths represent not merely a number, but the permanent removal of individuals from the ongoing story of their families and communities. Parents who would have raised children, children who would have become adults, artists who would have created works not yet imagined, teachers who would have educated future generations. Each death truncated possibilities and futures that now exist only as absences. Grief operates on timescales that extend far beyond disaster response phases. Initial shock and acute grief eventually transition into chronic grief that becomes part of survivors' ongoing existence. Holidays, anniversaries, and ordinary days all carry reminders of loss. Parents who lost children experience ongoing grief without resolution. Children who lost parents navigate developmental milestones without parental presence. Spouses who lost partners face decades of life alone. Some individuals remain missing, their fates unknown. Bodies recovered from rubble sometimes could not be identified due to decomposition or fragmentation. Families exist in states of ambiguous loss, unable to complete burial rituals or achieve psychological closure because uncertainty prevents acceptance. These families occupy a particular category of suffering, unable to grieve fully because definitive knowledge of death remains absent. The physical reconstruction of cities will eventually erase the visible evidence of destruction. New buildings will rise where collapsed structures once stood. Streets will be repaved. Infrastructure will be rebuilt. The landscape will gradually lose the physical markers of disaster, but this physical restoration cannot restore what was lost. New buildings are not the same buildings. They lack the history, the memories, and the associations that made the destroyed structures meaningful to those who inhabited them. Memory preservation faces challenges of time and attention. As years pass, public focus shifts to other events and concerns. The earthquakes fade from national and international consciousness. Survivors themselves age and eventually die, taking their direct memories with them. Without intentional efforts to document, record, and memorialize, the events risk becoming historical footnotes rather than preserved collective memory. The altered landscape represents a permanent before and after division in the region's history. Time is now measured relative to the earthquakes. Events are dated as occurring before or after February 6. 2023, this temporal division extends indefinitely into the future. Generations born after the earthquakes will grow up in cities shaped by destruction they never witnessed, inheriting landscapes marked by trauma they did not experience directly. Resilience, frequently invoked in disaster contexts, does not erase trauma or loss. Communities and individuals do adapt, continue living, and rebuild aspects of their disrupted lives. But this adaptation occurs alongside ongoing suffering, not as its replacement. The capacity to function after disaster represents human adaptability, not the absence of pain or the resolution of loss. Documentation creates records that outlast individual memory. Written accounts, photographs, and systematic documentation of the disaster serve as external memory storage that persists beyond the lifespans of those who experienced the events directly. These records allow future generations to encounter the disaster as more than abstract historical fact. Preserving the human dimensions of suffering and survival, the responsibility to remember extends beyond those directly affected. Societies that fail to maintain memory of disasters risk repeating preventable failures. Building practices, emergency response protocols, and land use decisions all benefit from institutional memory of past disasters. The earthquakes offer lessons about construction quality, code enforcement, and the consequences of accumulated risk that remain relevant indefinitely. The names of the dead exist on memorial lists, in family memories, and in official records. Each name represents a life that was lived and then ended suddenly on a February morning. The magnitude of loss becomes more comprehensible when considered as the sum of individual losses rather than as aggregate statistics. Each of the 53,000 deaths represents complete erasure of that individual's future and creates cascading loss for everyone who knew them. What remains after the disaster includes both the survivors and the altered landscape. The survivors carry forward their memories and their losses. The landscape carries the imprint of what occurred, visible in the new construction that fills spaces where older structures once stood. Together, these elements constitute the living memory of February 6, 2023, a memory that will be carried forward by those who experienced it and transmitted to those who did not, preserving the knowledge of what was lost when the ground broke and cities fell. The night ended, the shaking stopped, but nothing stayed where it was. February 6, 2023, was not only a date when the Earth's crust fractured, it was a threshold where a society's sense of time, safety, and continuity was shattered after that night. Life did not flow the same way. The same streets were walked, but they were no longer the same cities. The same names were spoken, but their voices were incomplete. The scale of destruction was expressed in numbers, magnitudes, kilometers, tons. Statistics stopped, but loss went beyond numbers. Every ruin was an unfinished story. Every silence was an unsaid sentence. Some still hear the sound of that night. Some still feel the shaking in their sleep. For some, time stopped at 4:17. Cities can be rebuilt. Buildings can rise again. Roads can be covered with asphalt. But a child's final embrace with a parent, a mother's voice cut short, a home that becomes nothing more than an address, can never be brought back. This documentary was not told to show destruction, but to remember what must not be forgotten, because remembering is not only looking back at the past. Remembering is the responsibility to make the future less fragile. The ground is still moving. Time goes on. Life continues. But February 6, 2023, will remain not as the day the Earth broke, but as the day it was engraved into human memory. If you are thinking about which disaster, natural event, or forgotten story you would like to see in the next documentary, let's meet in the comments.